Hello everybody, welcome to BLS002. Today we're gonna be looking at adding a GraphQL CRUD endpoint to our NestJS API. Welcome everybody, thanks for joining in. I got a small recipe here of things I want to do today. So to recap, yesterday we created an API in an NX workspace with NestJS. And we added a simple GraphQL query that just shows the uptime. This is where we left off. And then additionally, we deployed this GraphQL API to Heroku. So we have a live instance. Now I'm using the free plan of Heroku, so this currently needs to warm up a little bit. These instances fall asleep. But for developing and for prototyping, this is super nice. So starting today, I got some music here. I got some fancy tunes. This morning I was in Brandon Roberts' stream, and he was playing some beats, and I wanted this as well. Additionally, I hope I fixed my computer issues. I hope that OBS is not running at like 1500% again. But we'll see. So let's get going. What are we going to do today is create a new library called Course. Inside that library, we're going to create our models, course and lesson, which have a relationship. A course can contain various lessons. We'll create a CourseResolver, create the queries and mutations to list of courses, get an individual course, and add some mutations to create, update, and delete courses. And then finally, we'll create a backing service. And I'll probably just for now use an in-memory array of objects. And then in a following stream, we're going to look at how to use Prisma to actually wire the whole thing up. So let's start off by opening the project in my IDE. Also, I bumped up the font size a little bit. I hope this is better than yesterday. When I was reviewing it on YouTube, I saw that there was quite some times where I forgot to adjust the font. So I hope this is a bit more legible for everybody. And I configured this editor to have like huge fonts all around. So if it's too small, just let me know and I'll happily adjust. But this is the project. We have the API. Here, an application, and we have a library called core. So we're going to add a sibling here and call it course. Let's get going. For that we do nx generate at narwhal nest lib and give it the name course, and that scaffolds out our course library. I'm keeping an eye open on my computer's performance. Any second now. There might still be some things to optimize here. So one of the things I can do in the meanwhile is define some more things here. So what we can check here is, 1 second, create the course model and define it here. So course will have a title, a description, we'll have an array of lessons. These are both strings. And let's add a cover URL. Let's say image URL. And that should be enough. And in the meanwhile, this thing got created, so that's good. Let's quickly define a lesson. I think lesson also has a title. It might have a small description. And we're going to have the content, which is going to be the markdown. So this should be a fairly simple structure. Later, optionally, we can add stuff like duration here. And optionally for course, we might want to add things like objectives as an array of string. So we have some various data types that we can look at. But let's start off simple. So the library got created. And then the first thing I generally do is start loading that library in my AppModule, just like we did with the core library yesterday. So open this one up and import CourseModule here. Let's make sure this catches up. The background music a little too low. Okay, cool. I'm gonna adjust it in a second. This is what Chow advises me. Because in my ears it's actually a bit too high. I can hardly hear myself speaking, so I need to adjust it a little bit. But we can do that right away. So let's see. Hey, Lars is here. Yes, Lars, we're building the BEEHIVE. Okay, I'm boosting the boosting the music a little bit. Let me know what you think and if you hear it. There's a new track starting out. I actually added a little small indicator right above here that you can see which track it is. So in the meanwhile, our API started, CourseModule has been loaded, so that's all good. And what we can do now is define the models that we're going to use. So what I'm going to do is create a new file here. And that's going to be inside the models folder, and it's going to be course.ts. This is going to export a class called course. And we're going to decorate it with the object type. Now this is a decorator that comes from NestJS GraphQL. And while it loads, we can just use it like this. We don't need to pass in anything. And once we have this, we can define our properties. So let's first define them. Description, lessons, which is a lesson array. We're going to add lesson in a second. Description. Let's comment it out for now. And these properties will be decorated with the field decorator. That also comes from NestJS GraphQL. Now, one thing I'd like to do in general is make all properties nullable. So this tells GraphQL that we might not receive this property. And this is something I've seen in quite a lot of GraphQL APIs. A lot of properties are nullable here, and let's just make them optional here. So at least this doesn't get in the way. We can always stricten it up a bit later. So this is our first model. Second model is lesson. Oh, that went a bit too enthusiastic with the dots there. Let's just call it lesson.ts. And for lesson, we're going to have another field. Field nullable is true. This is going to be an ID string. And let's copy it over a few times. So lesson's going to have a title, also description, and content, which would be the markdown. Let's do it like this. Okay, cool. So what I want to do here is in my course is refer to the lessons as a lesson array. So I create the object lessons, and one of the things I need to do here in my fields definition is actually define which type I'm gonna return. And this is an array of lesson, an array of this object, and you need to have this structure. We're also gonna make this one nullable, and we're gonna set lessons optional here as well. So with this, we have our basic models in place. This is all pretty straightforward. Let's quickly peek if I didn't forget some image URL. Let's get image URL there as well. In the course, copy it over and use image URL. Now, that's the first step. Second step is creating the CourseResolver. Let's save this quickly. We're having a discussion about code editors in the chat. Yes, I'm using WebStorm. I'm actually using IDEA. IntelliJ IDEA. I really love it. But it's probably as old as the computer itself. Discussion about which editor to use. So now, with this in place, I can start implementing the resolver. And as we learned yesterday, the resolver is the class that adds the functionality, the endpoints, to the GraphQL API. So if we peek here and we peek in our docs, we see that we now have just one query uptime. Let's start out with a query that lists an array of courses. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a file called course.resolver.ts. And this is going to export a class CourseResolver. And I'm going to decorate it with the resolver decorator that comes from NestJS GraphQL. We can just do it like this. It takes some options. You could change the name if you want. You can define the return type. And this is what might come in handy later. So we can say this resolver resolves type course. But for now, just let's leave it as is. Now, one of the methods I want to have here is the method courses, which returns an array of courses. Let's just return an empty array for now. And we're going to decorate it with the query decorator. That also comes from NestJS GraphQL. Make sure to not download it, import it from NestJS Common, as suggested here, because that will not work and will give you nasty errors. Now the query, we need to define which type we want to return. So here we're going to say we're going to return an array of course. And that's it. We defined our resolver. We instructed it that it needs to return an array of course. And now in order to load this resolver, we need to provide it here inside our course module. So we go to providers, we say CourseResolver. We load it in. And once that restarts the API, we'll see that we have another endpoint in our documentation. So wait a second till the server reloads. Okay, we have an error here. Cannot determine GraphQL output type for the lessons. Make sure your class is decorated with an appropriate decorator. So what it looks like is that we didn't decorate the, well, I didn't decorate the lesson. There you go. Object type. Live coding, people, that's what happens. That's like what happens in the real life. Cool, so, okay, we can see that the API is now started. And once we get back to our browser and we reload it, we can see that we now have the queries endpoint, which returns an array of queries. So this information is now being exposed by our API, by our GraphQL API, and we can use courses query here and just ask for properties. But as we just return an empty array, there's nothing going to be here. So this is the first query resolver. Let's quickly scaffold out individual query, which is a variation on this one. So it's course singular. We're going to return a single object, and I'm just going to return, we're probably just going to return null for now. So same deal. We're going to watch the server restart. Now, actually, for those of you paying attention, which is hopefully everybody, I think I said the same thing yesterday, but I hope you're all paying attention. If we want to get an individual course, most of the times we want to have a reference to which course it is. So it's not very likely that we're just going to say, give me a course. We want to pass in which course. And another thing we want to address is that we can indeed return nullable fields. So let's add that one first. Let's say here we'll allow nullable results. That's fine if it's at some moment it's null. And then once the server restarts, we should be able to ask this query course null. Okay, that works. So what we actually want to do in here is pass in an ID and say this is course intro to GraphQL. So in order to do this, we can decorate the methods that we have here and add the args decorator. And we're going to say here we take an argument ID and create a local reference injected as ID. Any second now. Here you go. And let's log it out for good measures. So we execute the query again, and then we get the ID here. So this is what we can use in a little bit to find our ID in the database or in the in-memory object that we're going to use in this live stream. So create the queries. Now we're going to create the mutations. And actually, I'm going to first create the service right now so we have a place to actually look at the data and work with it. So let's go back here. Create course.service.ts. Export class CourseService. Make it injectable. This is going to be imported from NestJS Common. And let's just start out with, I'm just going to call it items, which is an array of course. Add one here, intro to GraphQL, with a title, Introduction to GraphQL. And let's leave it for now. We allow these things to be empty, these fields to be empty. So then GraphQL for experts course. Cool, so we have 2 items in our array. And now in our CourseResolver, we're going to inject this one. And make this course method just return the courses, make it return the courses from the service here. I'm going to implement this method and say return this dot items. So that's one. For the second one, we're going to say return this dot service dot course singular. I'm going to pass in the ID and create the method here. And we're going to use the find method on the array to find the item with that ID. So this all looks pretty well. Last thing we should do, because we inject the CourseServer here, we need to go to our course module and provide it. So with these two things in place, we should now be able to get a list of our courses. Let's see, courses, just get all the IDs and get a singular course, and it both works. This is one of the things I really like about GraphQL. You can do multiple queries in one go. So this is our courses query. We get back the IDs of both of our courses, and this is the individual course. Now let's just see if the other one works as well. There's no reason it shouldn't, but just let's make sure. There you go. Cool. So with that in place, next thing to do is add our create, update, and delete. Now in GraphQL, queries are for fetching data and mutations are for updating data. So for the create course, we want to have a mutation. And this mutation is going to be imported from NestJS GraphQL. This mutation is going to return the course, and it might be null. Let's get rid of this ID here. Now, what we want to do here is we want to call into this.service.createCourse. I generally keep these things the same. I want to take an argument called input. But this argument is a complex type. So I want to have an input that gives the title, the description, and the image URL. Probably make title required and the rest of it optional. And pass that in. And in order to do this, we're going to create an input type, a DTO data transfer object. So inside our library, inside DTO, we're going to say create-course.input.ts, which, you guessed it, exports a class. And this class is going to be decorated with the input type coming from NestJS GraphQL. Wait a second for my computer to catch up. Now, what do we want to do here is have a field called title, which is not optional. This is the required field. So we can at least add fields with a title. And then we can have some optional fields. Let's say description, which is nullable. Image URL is nullable as well. And this is the way to tell GraphQL that this is the shape of the input we want when we want to create a course. So I'm going to use this one and refer to it here. Import it. And now in this create course method, I'm just going to pass in this raw input object that we get. So we get it here. And then, because we're not in a database, I'm going to do some new course. For ID, I'm just probably going to use date.now, not to string. So we at least have a unique-ish ID, and then destructure the rest of input. And this should be a course. Seems like that works. And for now, just do a this.items.push. Just push it to the this.items.push. Push in the new course. Return the new course. So with that in place, we should be able to add new courses to our array here and retrieve them later. So let's wait till the server is restarted. It's just going on in the background. I'm going to open a new tab here to do the mutations. There you go, server's restarted. There we go, and we now see that we have a mutation with, it's called CreateCourse, and you can here see that this is the input that we created. So we're going to provide title, description, and image URL, and once we retrieve that same course, we should see those fields. So let's do the mutation, CreateCourse, input, takes an object, and say title is new course. Give it a description. And let's leave image URL out for now. And what I want to get back here is the ID of the course that gets generated. So this is the timestamp. When we now switch back to this tab, let's comment out the individual one for a second. We should see that we have the new ID with the title and the description. So far, so good. So next thing in our CRUD is a way to update this course. Now, update and creation are very similar. I think the only difference is that we don't want to make title required in the update DTO. I'm just going to copy over this file. UpdateCourseInput. Change the name. Make the field nullable and optional. And use that one. So that's it for the input DTO. I'm gonna simply copy over this stuff, change the name, update. Update course input. And create a method. So this is getting quite repetitive, but let's deal with it. So one thing we need to change actually is we need to also know which course we want to update. So we're also going to pass in, not only ask for the input, but we're also going to add for the ID. And then we know which course we want to update, and the input is the new course. So let's do that. Quickly update the method signature here. There we go. So we can use the this.course method to find the actual course. And then what we want to do is update the course. Let's just go a very imperative way. Updated is course and spread input over it. I got a new follower, thanks, I appreciate it. And the updated one is what we will eventually return. Now in the next session I will replace this with a database, so this code is as good as it needs to be for now. And yet another follower. You folks keep coming, I really appreciate it, thanks. So what we want to do right now is reassign this.items. And if item.id equals to the ID we get passed in, we want to return the updated. And otherwise, we just want to return the item. So this is a super imperative way to just update an existing item in the array. So let's see if this works. So when saving this and restarting the API, we should have a new endpoint. And this means we should be able to take the intro to GraphQL API and change its description. We don't have a description right now. So let's see. UpdateCourse, pass in the ID, and just add a description. So this is the description of intro to GraphQL. Execute it, and if we now list the items again, we see that we updated the item. So far, so good. And last thing to create is the D in CRUD, which is delete. So let's go over this deletion again. So what we want to do with delete is another mutation, and this mutation I'm going to make it return a Boolean. So the Boolean is going to return true if it found it and it could delete it, and it's going to return false if it can't find it or if it can't delete it. So in order to delete a thing, we need its ID. So we're going to say ID is string. And we're going to return this.service.deleteCourse. With ID. So create the method. First, going to try to get a hold of the course. If we don't have a course, we're going to return false right away. That's probably the only case where it's missed, where it's not going to work. So otherwise, we're going to return true. And we're going to recreate the items. And using a filter. Items. And filter out where item ID not equals ID. I think I'm always confused if I need to do it negative or positive, but let's see. I'm sorry I'm not keeping up with the chat at all. My Mac specs, they're actually quite good. Ciao, I got it this year in in February. They're pretty decent, but I'm not sure why it's hogging down so much. But it's, I mean, yeah, we can look at the loads, but it's pretty terrible. But it's even better than yesterday. Yesterday was pretty bad. I had modules being created, like an ng generate command. Yesterday it took like 4 minutes or something when I was reviewing the stream. It's not at all what I'd like. So let's see. We're gonna have the deleteCourse endpoint, and let's make sure this is refreshed so we get nice GraphQL auto-completion. So this is one of the fun things I think with GraphQL. It's now telling me like, hey, this deleteCourse returns a Boolean. And I'm actually trying to ask data from it. So field deleteCourse must have a selection since type Boolean has no subfields. So this ID is a subfield. And we don't want this. So first time we run the deleteCourse on the intro to GraphQL, we get true. And second time we now should get false. So this works as expected. And if we now add a list of courses, we should just have one list, which is GraphQL for experts. Let's make sure that this one can be deleted as well. And if so, true. Now it should be false. And if we go to courses, it's now empty. So with that, we've implemented the operations we need to have a complete CRUD. It's still pretty much work in process because we would really like to use a database for this. But once we'll do this, we'll see that this resolver shouldn't change. So this is the resolver. This is the public API that we defined for our courses. And let's create a new branch here. And let's do a commit. Feature add CRUD for CourseModule. Now, one thing we didn't really look at is lessons, and it might be a nice thing to adjust. So, oh, I need to say what I want to commit. So what we can think of is having an API endpoint that adds lessons. So that would basically behold a CreateLesson endpoint that takes a course ID and the information of the lesson that we want to capture. Let's go do that. We're 40 minutes in the stream, so I think we should pop in some more stuff. Actually, let's first add some lessons to our dummy data here. So lessons is, I got a lesson with the ID of lesson-1 and the title of introduction to the course. Hello, student. And let's see, let's add 2 or 3 more. Let's make sure it's just unique for now. It's not really. It's not really that important anyway, but so we added some dummy data. And now in our Explorer, in our playground, we should be able to see the lessons being added here as well. There you go. Lessons. So what I'd like to do is have a CreateLesson endpoint which takes the ID of the course, a title and a description, and the content, and an UpdateLesson which takes the ID of the lesson and the updated title and course. And I think to keep it all simple, I'm just going to add them onto this resolver. That means we're going to have 2 more methods, CreateLesson and UpdateLesson, and probably want to delete lesson. Okay, so let's not do it this way. I'm going to do it a little bit different. So what I'm going to do is create a folder resolvers. So my rule of thumb with Nest and Angular is when I have 2 of something, I'm creating a folder. So I have 1 service. It's fine, I'm going to keep it top level next to the module. I have 1 resolver, I'm going to keep it top level next to the module. Now that I'm going to add 2, I'm going to create a folder for them. This is just something I've been working with for a bit and it works pretty well. So just personal convention. So while that's moving, we can create the lesson resolver. So LessonResolver.ts, which exports a class LessonResolver. I'm still going to use the CourseService, inject it here. I'm going to decorate this with the Resolver decorator. Yes, please. Import it from here. Import it, please. Yes, there we go. And we're going to provide it in the module here. So that's one, the LessonResolver. Now, for these lessons, we're going to use the, we're going to create a different DTO. So I'm going to copy paste over this one, call it CreateLessonInput. Now the lesson has a title, a description, and a content. I'm only going to make title required. And then for the update lesson input, I'm going to make the title field optional, just like how I did with the courses. So with these two DTOs in place, I can go ahead and implement Resolver here. So that's going to be a mutation. And this mutation is going to return the lesson. And we're going to say nullable is true. And this will be the createLesson method. And the createLesson method takes an argument of lesson ID, course ID, and it takes an argument input, which is CreateLessonInput. CreateLessonInput, there we go. Let's pop it full screen for now. And then we call into our service, we actually return this.service.createLesson, passing the course ID and the input. So as you can see, these methods that I'm defining here, these resolvers, are super straightforward and predictable. And this is something I really like. This CourseResolver, the name of the function here is the same. The argument is the same. And if you do some smart things, like you can, for instance, make this course, you can strongly type it and just make it return course array, and this one singular course. There's a lot you can do with having these code generated. And yeah, Chow, I've seen you work on the NestJS mapper. I think this is a very nice candidate for doing a similar thing, where you can basically just instruct like, hey, this is my resolver, this is the type I'm working with, this is the service, and then go figure it all out. But I'd like to keep my resolvers like this. They have almost no logic. They just call into the service, and these things in the service are highly reusable. So these things are, you can reuse them from a REST controller as well if you like. But that aside, let's move on with our create lesson. Say create lesson here, and we're going to take the input here, import that one, import this. I made a mistake here in update lesson. I need to change the name. I copied it, but I didn't change the name. Okay, there we go. Cool. So new lesson has an ID, which is date.now.toString, and then destructure the input. Now what we need to do is find the course by course ID. So we say this.course, pass in the course ID. And then basically update the course. So what I would like to do is reuse this updateCourse method here. And what I'm going to do is add an optional parameter here. And gonna say lessons here equals so let's do it this way. If we have lessons, if we get lessons passed in, assign these lessons, otherwise use course.lessons. It's a bit hacky for now, but this will be fixed once we get the database in place. So for now I'm just going to go with the updateCourse method, take in the course ID and add a lesson method, and that should give us the option to add lessons here. So still going to get the course, update course with course ID, get an empty object in, and then destructure course.lessons and add the new lesson to it. And this should allow us to add new lessons to a course. So let's see if that works. New lesson. So restart the API. So Mark is saying that like update. Right, okay, yeah. The map type is a helper library to compute DTOs. Don't repeat yourself. And there's definitely a ton of reusing we can do. And actually with the API, the database layer that I'm using, Prisma, is emitting TypeScript types. So I think I can gain a lot by smartly using this. This is definitely an optimization I need to look into. For now, I'm pretty fine with doing it this way. It's super boring and straightforward code, which is good. So let's see. We have our intro to GraphQL course. We have 2 lessons. So let's now say create. Let's refresh so we get autocomplete. Let's say create lesson. Pass in the course ID. And the input is gonna be title new lesson for intro course. I'm just gonna take the ID. There you go. It got created. And once we look here now, we see we have the new lesson. So I consider these ones to be unique. So for updating a lesson, I only want to have this ID and take in the things we defined in our DTO. So let's scaffold out update lesson. Here we're just taking an ID. And let's quickly move to full screen here and update lesson input. There we go. Now implement the update lesson method. And this gets tricky. So the issue here is that I want to update the ID here, but I have them in these, so I need to basically loop over my items and then find in these items if I have lessons. I will do that. Cheers, Lars. It was nice having you. Glad you enjoyed it. You can review it on YouTube if you like to see the rest of it. Glad you like my workflow, Chow. I'd love to see your input on how you do stuff like this. So let's see. First, we want to find the lesson. And in order for that, what we actually need to do is go over the... Can we do 2 finds? I'm not even sure. So one quick way to get this going is basically also ask for the course ID and then ask course ID and lesson ID. I think that's the most pragmatic thing to do right now. So course ID, and let's be more explicit here and call this one lesson ID. And then I say course ID here, lesson ID here. So I know from which course I need to take the lesson. It's very likely that I will refactor this when Prisma is in place. But for now, let's go with it. So then this is course ID. So I'm going to get the course ID. And I'm going to get the lesson is from course.lessons.find. Item where item ID item where item ID equals lesson ID. So now with the lesson, I need to update this lesson. Let's quickly peek how I did the update of the course. I create and update it. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to say create updated of type lesson. I'm going to destructure in the existing one and destructure in the input. So this gives us the updated lesson. And what we now need to do is reassign course.lessons. Map over it. Get each individual item. By default, return it, except if item ID equals lesson ID. We want to return the updated. There's for sure ways to do this with less code. Ternary expression, and actually you can ask, in most cases, I think in WebStorm, I don't see it from IntelliJ here, but in WebStorm you can just call up the context menu and have it replaced with the ternary expression. I think this is good because it's imperative. Now, and if all the references are right, I think this should work as is. We shouldn't need to update the lesson, I think. Let's see. So now, what are we going to do? We're going to say intro GraphQL, take lesson 1 and change the content. So, update lesson. Let's refresh again to make sure that we have the latest. Update lesson, course ID intro GraphQL. Lesson ID is lesson-1. Let's see, let's just change title. New title for lesson 1. And if we now ask the list of courses, new title for lesson 1. So it's a bit hacky because we use the referential nature from TypeScript, but I'm totally fine with this setup. With this in place, last thing we need to do is get a method to delete our lessons. So let's get this into place, delete lesson. I'm gonna ask for the course and the lesson. And I'm gonna have it return a Boolean. Gonna create this method here. And I'm actually gonna use the first 2 lines of the update lesson, because if we can't find the lesson, or if we can't find the course, we're gonna return false. If we can't find the lesson, we're also gonna return false. Now, once we have this, we'll always return true. The only thing we need to do is make sure that course.lessons is going to get filtered, and it filters out this lesson. So let's see, course.lessons equals course.lessons.filter. Where item ID is not lesson ID. And with that, I think we have the create, update, and delete for the lessons in place. So let's give this a final spin. Let's see if the API restarts, which it does right here. There we go. Refresh the schema here. And then we can simply change this query, get rid of the input, get rid of the return statement. Run it. The first time is true, second time is false. And if we now check the list of courses, we should see that we only have 1 lesson. So we can get rid of this lesson, get rid of lesson 2, 1 true, second time false. And we have no lessons left in this course. So if we take a quick look at our schema, we can see we added the 2 queries. One of them is the courses array. One of them is the single course, which takes an ID. We then created the mutations to create a course, update a course, and delete a course. And added to that the create lesson, update lesson, and delete lesson. Now here in the code, this is all very much the same for both lesson and course, but let's go over the CourseResolver here. So what we did, we created a class called CourseResolver, we decorated it with the Resolver class, we injected our service, and then we defined the 2 queries here and the 3 mutations right there. For the mutations, we created input types, which are plain old TypeScript objects with the input type decorator. And we defined which fields, and here we can pass in which ones are optional and which ones are required. And then the other thing to note is the objects itself. We started out with defining these 2. The course, which is another plain old TypeScript object, decorated it with the object type and passed in the fields. And we did the same for lesson. For now, as a temporary implementation, the CourseService, we used an in-memory object to store everything. We created a dummy structure here. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can add Prisma database to do this. And with that, I'd like to wrap up this stream. Thank you all very much for checking it out. You can follow me on Twitter at BEEMAN_NL. All these recordings will also be on YouTube. This was BLS002. Thank you very much. I'm out.